Okay, so here we go, tutorial 2. This is covering topics 4, 5 and 6 in um, which are identified on Blackboard. Now, the previous session was really preoccupied with what I would refer to as leader-centric models. And what we did start to discuss was how much we really knew about leadership and whether or not those models, those leader-centric models, were reflective of our lived experiences, were representative of leadership as we have practiced it and leadership as we perceive it. And we concluded to suggest that possibly this was not the case. And in this particular session, what we'll try and do, therefore, is we'll cover alternative ways of thinking about leadership. Firstly, I want to talk about perspective which is known as social constructionism. And I've given the title of the slide as Moving Beyond the Leader, Discussing the Undiscussable. Because if you really start to focus upon leadership where the leader themselves are not or is not the central focus of the perspective of the theory and its application, then are we really talking about leadership anymore? Now, I would argue very much that we are, because I have a tendency to not really privilege the position of the leader and the leader as an individual, or privilege their importance in the relationship. There are other factors that need to be drawn attention to. Now, social constructionism is not really a way of thinking about leadership in its entirety. What it is really is a way of thinking about our lived experiences more generally. But we can apply this to leadership, I think. But first of all, we need to really go back and think about social constructionism. And within this particular perspective, social reality is co-constructed by the agents within that society. In other words, reality is made by the people that are within it, and it privileges the use of language and communication. To give you an idea about this is that if we're trying to explain somebody, or we're trying to refer to something which is quite complex, or think about something, is that we tend to use language. After all, what else is there? And in doing this, and the using the language, is that we make things happen. We can construct the reality, therefore, out of language. Language makes realities, our lived experiences, and our meanings that are associated with the language gives our lived experiences context. So why, therefore, have there been growth in social constructionist approaches to leadership? Principally because the explanatory power of previous approaches is not very good, either theoretically or even practically. Is that one person's transformational leader is another person's failure or menace, and so on and so forth. Is that the theories themselves are not that consistent when you apply them to realities. And as a consequence of that is that a number of different scholars have attempted to explore different perspectives that have got a better way of explaining things to people. So let's see if we can just do that. Let's consider social constructionism, and let's consider models of leadership within the social constructionist phrase. Most importantly is that what we're not doing here is that we're not engaging in the sort of normative leader-centric models, which are, as I've said, normative or functional, in that that's the way that things ought to be, the way that things should be. In this approach, all members of the leadership relationship, irrespective of whom or what they are, have the capacity to make their own meanings. They're not therefore reliant upon the nominal leader to tell them what to do. I can interpret language. I can interpret what people say. I can read into it. As a subjective individual myself, is that I have the capacity to make my own meaning. Okay? So social constructionism and leadership really Privileges the consequences of the interactions that are between people, because these relationships, these social consequences of relationships, help to formulate meanings between different sets of people, whether it be the leader, the follower, or any other kind of relationship to the leadership relationship. So if somebody is just an observer, is that you can still take meaning from the interactions between leaders and followers. And to give you a practical example, let's think of this paper that I've given you in the reading from Rosenzweig, which is about halos, the halo effect. And what Rosenzweig says is that so many of the things that we, managers, journalists, professors and consultants commonly think contribute to company performance are often attributions based upon performance. The halo effect is a way for the mind to create and to maintain a coherent and consistent picture, to reduce cognitive dissonance. The halo effect is too strong, the desire to tell a coherent story too great, the tendency to jump on bandwagons too appealing. So in this instance, what we might actually want to consider is that, let's say that something was being very successful, and we might attribute the success of that activity or that firm or that project to the leadership that's been going on. So in doing that, we forget about all of the other things that might well contribute or might well have contributed to the success of that particular activity, including all of the activity and all of the practices that every other agent that was involved in doing it as well. The leader didn't do it on their own, but the halo effect creates a convenient story that leadership is responsible. An example of this might be if we were to consider the leadership lessons of Steve Jobs. The book written about Steve Jobs by Isaacson is a popular seller, and it's one of those things that's kind of recommended in terms of leadership thinking, of how to be a maverick but we're within the frame. Jobs is credited with the success of Apple, of the generation of products and so on and so forth. Is that many of my younger students would actually credit Jobs with the invention of the not only the iPhone, but I think in a push, the invention of the internet as well. But let us consider what Isaacson says are the real leadership lessons of Steve Jobs. And it's the text that I've got on the slide there. A leader, according to Isaacson's interpretation of Jobs at least, should focus, simplify, look under end-to-end responsibility. When behind, leapfrog. Put products before profit. Don't be a slave to focus groups. Bend reality. Impute. Push for perfection. Tolerate only A players. Engage face-to-face. Know the big picture and the details. Combine the humanities and science. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. What kind of advice is that? But the halo effect makes the story out of it to the extent where it's almost like we want to believe in the leadership of Jobs, of somebody like Jobs. But actually the advice that's given here in terms of the leadership lessons is nothing more than gibberish. At best, it's do everything well. At worst, it's nonsense. And if we were to consider Apple's profits over a period of time, is that we might really want to reflect upon whether or not Jobs was such a successful leader anyway. Is that by the time that Jobs was poorly and had taken a secondary role within Apple, and Tim Cook had taken over unofficially or on an interim basis, and then officially at least, sort of 2009-10 onwards, is that that's the period at which actually Apple's profits, its net income had really started to grow and has grown in that hockey stick trajectory. And furthermore, we might want to consider the value of Apple as a company. If you go back before this graph, in actual fact, is that the share price of Apple and the value of Apple had barely grown at all since its incorporation in the 1980s. And again, it's not until Cook enters the picture that Apple's market capitalization really takes off, to the extent where in late 2008, either late 2018 or early 2019, I've given the date there, isn't it? So the 8th of February 2018, Apple were the first $1 trillion valued company. But even though the previous two slides might suggest that there's something that needs to be reconsidered concerning the leadership of Apple, is that, and we might well think that Cook has done a different and better job than Jobs had done previously to that. If we also consider Apple's stock price, is that again the dramatic rise is 2010 onwards. But this in itself is also misleading. Now, this chart that I've given you here stops in February 2015 because Apple did something quite interesting in 2015. This was when Cook had announced a bond, or issued a bond onto the open market. It was a bond that was for $4 billion, which Apple actually sold for $6 billion. So they raised $6 billion on the open debt markets, but what did they do with it is that they bought back their own shares. And this wasn't the first time that Apple had done it. It was just the time that I was sort of like looking at it, and it occurred at the time that I wanted to talk about Apple's and various companies' share buybacks. By buying back your own shares, you effectively remove a proportion of the shares from the market, and therefore the price of the existing or the remaining shares goes up in proportion to those that's been taken away. So Cook had been engaging in very specific shareholder-driven activities, to the extent that its financial officer says that they plan to be very active in the US and other debt markets in 2016 in order to be able to fund our capital return activities. In other words, they are very clear about wanting to return money back to shareholders. But this has the impact of driving the share price, which also has the impact of driving the market capitalization, and so on and so forth. So when you start to look into the detail of the businesses themselves, is that the halo, the strong story, might be about the leadership, but that would not be paying attention to the other activities that are going on within the organization. And I've just given you a snapshot of some of them here, because we're not taking into account, say, the design that's been put together by Ives, the outsourcing and the movement of Apple production to China and other parts of the world, opening up corporate offices in tax efficient jurisdictions, its development of its own cash assets and its utilization of cash assets for financial activities which drive more income through the business. Apple's a fantastically complex business, but we have a tendency to look for the simple and to the convenient and say Apple's success is down to the leadership of Jobs, the foundations that he created, and as subsequently this has been carried on by Tim Cook. Is this too simple, I ask? And if you remember last time, I highlighted these particular individuals, all of which have written a book about their own leadership. All right, Isaacson wrote the book about Jobs, but it was published shortly after his death, and I'm pretty convinced that Jobs, as a control freak, would have had quite a considerable say-so in what Isaacson was writing. So their own stories embellish the halo effects. And our conceptualization of their leadership is based upon their own story and the halos that go with it. But how much of that is the truth, or is the reality, or the lived experiences of other people that work for these organizations? They don't achieve these things on their own. And so I want to introduce you to this paper by Linda Smirchich and Gareth Morgan. It's an old paper, 1982, but just because it's old doesn't mean to say it's not still relevant. After all, don't we still read the Greek classics? To my mind, this is a really important paper. It's a seminal paper in terms of a development of a social constructionist way of thinking about leadership. And within their paper, and I do encourage you to read all of it actually, is that they ask some really pertinent questions about the nature of leadership. If actually we were to consider the absence of leadership, is that our dominant frames might suggest that we've got an absence of organisation. What they're suggesting here is that the organisation, the firm, if you like, the company, the public utility can't exist without the leadership. Could you conceptualize of your organisation without the leadership? Managers enact a particular form of social reality with far-reaching but often poorly misunderstood or poorly understood and appreciated consequences. Management's impact on the social reality is extensive. Managers create the meaning for subordinate people. You, as a leader, manager of a group of people, create meaning for others. Others will accept your meanings pretty much not exclusively and without question, but nevertheless is that because of your position within the hierarchy and the power that you have, is that your meaning, the meaning that's being attributed to you, is likely to be more readily accepted. So you are crafting a social reality for other people. So what they also suggest is that really leaders should try and negate their own tendency to say what needs to happen, and actually they want to represent leadership as being a process of learning from different scenarios, not just leadership scenarios, but wider scenarios within the organisation themselves, within which a wider constituency of voices can be heard and can be considered. In other words, is that management making meaning, which is leadership, is replaced by managers co-creating meaning, and that too can constitute leadership. In other words, the dominant view of the leader need not be the only view. The role of leadership, therefore, is to consolidate and to collect the views of those people that are relevant, if you like, but not just from the leadership scenario, i.e. not just necessarily followers. One needs to try and broaden one's horizons in order to collect the relevant voices. But in order for this to occur, really what we do need to do is that we need to rethink what we mean by leadership. There's another side, or there are other sides in actual fact of the leadership dilemma, the leadership conundrum. First, we need to look beyond the robust and simplistic conceptualizations of leadership to consider neglected elements of the constituent leadership relationship, of which there are three: followers, power, and politics. And I think that politics is an interesting one here, because very rarely, if often at all, would organisational politics be seen as a constituent part of the leadership. But to my mind and my conceptualisation and thinking of leadership, it's absolutely integral. So let's now unpack these three important but neglected elements of the leadership relationship. We need to think of the organisation as a wider system of different influences, and those influences can be mapped on this 2x2 grid. Systems of influences are formal or informal, and they can be sanctioned or can be unsanctioned. Now, politics itself, I think, is something which is informal and is unsanctioned, and as a consequence of that, it very rarely gets talked about, despite the fact that it happens in every single organisation. Leaders, therefore, that are not in tune with the political environment are likely to get steamrolled by it. The options, therefore, available to you are to ignore it or to learn to be with it and to not control, but be able to be aware of it and be able to utilise the political dimension within your own leadership too. If you doubt the impact of leadership, or of politics on leadership, look at your boss, or maybe even your boss's boss. I bet they're a better politician than you. I'll talk about politics again a bit later on. But let's go back to the first in that list and now start to think about followers. What role do followers have in the leadership relationship? Well, broadly speaking, for most of the normative conceptualizations, followers aren't very important. They're a blank slate upon which the leader writes their will, if you like. Leaders lead, followers follow. It's as simple as that. It's a zero-sum game, in other words, is that leaders lead, followers don't, because if they did, it would have an impact upon the leadership of the leader, the nominal leader. However, is the realities as simple as this? So as I said, within the nominal framing of leadership, within the neo-charismatic paradigm, followers are raw material to be moulded. Followers don't engage in followership. Followers have really have had their agency taken away from them, their independence, their ability to act of their own accord. Followers just follow. But if this is the case, why are followers, subordinates, people generally, so complicated? Why do they continually do things that surprise us and amaze us? Why don't they just do what they're told? Because followers are people, subjective people that can constitute their own meaning. They're not sheep. And as a consequence of that, they have agency. Followers can choose to follow who they want. They don't need to follow you. You need to provide them with a reason to do so. Obviously, when I say you, I mean you as a leader. I'm talking about leaders. Leaders are routinely surprised by the actions of their followers. Followers have agency, but in what form might this take? Well, there are a number of different ways that followers can behave, either in support of you or actually against you as well. Is it the case that followers transact? They'll follow you, but only if it's very clear about what's in it for them. The transactional element of the leader-follower relationship is very often ignored. And I would advise anybody that is in a leadership position to really think about transactionalism. Is that you can transact with somebody in order to be able to do something, and it can be quite effective. The transformational model contains both transformationalism and transactionalism. Transactionalism is underplayed to the extent that actually really people only ever think about the transformational stuff. Now that's interesting in itself, but I think that what it does say is it says more about the nature of transformationalism and more about how we see ourselves or how we would wish that ourselves was perceived as being a leader. It's more about our expectations than our lived realities. And Collinson warns that leaders shouldn't be lulled into false dichotomies. Followers are not a homogeneous group. People can have multiple selves or be possessed of multiple selves. They have the ability to create their own identities in other ways. They can present one identity to you and one identity to somebody else. And within that, they're quite capable of resisting. Other commentators, Chalif, have talked about followers as being courageous. And the courage comes from the constructive resistance of the leader themselves. And I've talked about the organizational fall, and what I'm referring to really as the organizational fall is somebody like Henry VIII's jester, the one that could whisper into the ear of His Majesty and informing him of when he was behaving inappropriately. Henry VIII's jester was the only person that was close to him that survived him. Was he behaving politically? We might ask. So let's turn our attention to another neglected element within the leader relationship, and that's the element of power. Power is derived from a number of different sources. Everybody has power. It might not be as high as others within the organisation. Power stems from legitimate authority, your position, the resources that you have at your disposal. It may be a social form of power. You may be an expert in your field, and you may be personal. But relations of power within organisations are never that straightforward. The leader relationship or the leader-follower relationship is asymmetrical. The leader has power, the follower has less so. The views of the leader, therefore, are privileged. Think about this now in the context of management of meaning. The leader, and the more senior the leader, the more privileged their position, the more capacity they have to make meaning. The chief executive officer's words may be unchallengeable as a consequence of this. But it's rarely quite so simple. Let's have a look at a different interpretation of power through the works of Foucault. Michel Foucault is a great contrarian. He's deliberately opaque, not very easy to understand, and I think that that's done deliberately by him. That's the way that he personally was. Nevertheless, he is one of the great social philosophers, and his work on power is well worth thinking about because his conceptualizations of power are different to many others. Foucault talked about social power, and he used the idea of the panopticon in order to explain his theories, or his, not really a theory, his perspective, I think. He's so contrary, he rejected the notion of theory. Now, the panopticon is not Foucault's idea. It's actually a much earlier conceptualization by Jeremy Bentham, several hundred years earlier. Bentham is the father of utilitarianism, which forms the foundation of much of market-based economics. But the panopticon is a prison, okay? And it's completely circular, which means that everybody can see everybody else because you're looking into the quadrangle and you can see across and you can see everybody. In other words, we're being observed, okay? Now, when you are aware that you're being observed, you change your behavior. In Foucault's words, you're disciplined, or you become disciplined. Now, look at the central tower here. The guard who sits in the central tower has got the view over all of the inmates. The inmates don't know if the central tower, the guard in the central tower, is watching them, but they are aware of the possibility that that happens. Okay? Now, Foucault goes one step further. The guard doesn't even need to be there. You don't know when you're being observed, but you are aware that you are being observed, and your behavior changes accordingly. Further to that, the guard themselves needs no special training. In other words, what Foucault is asserting here is that anybody can be the guard tower, anybody can be the inmate. We're all aware that we are being observed, and as a consequence of that, we discipline ourselves in order to make sure that we meet the expectations of the norm and the norms of the wider group. In other words, we discipline ourselves and we discipline others. The nature of power, therefore, is less coercive than it is in previous conceptualizations. Power is defined as being getting people to do things that they don't want. Foucault actually is presenting us with a view here is to say that people will do things that they don't particularly want because of their own disciplinary narratives and the social observances that are going on around them. In other words, we all contribute to our own power, and we all have power and we all use power, and we all contribute to our own disciplinary processes. If you combine this with the management of meaning and other sources of power, you've got a very potent cocktail in terms of trying to appreciate power relationships within leader-follower relationships, or power structures, I should say. That's probably a bit more appropriate. Power leads to politics. And politics may lead to conflict, political conflict between people. This was observed by Henry Mintzberg, who claims that the organisation is a political arena. And it's the arena of the leaders of tomorrow, because the leaders of tomorrow will have to survive the political arena that they find themselves at the time. Now, Mintzberg sees this as being very much as a straightforward, sort of coercive, or a straightforward contest of which the more astute, the more politically skilled, the stronger, more powerful individual will ultimately win out, and suggest that this is a contest of leadership. The leaders of tomorrow are the winners in the political arena of today, which is slightly different to the Foucauldian perspective about soft and disciplinary power, but nevertheless is that my guess is that you would all be able to think about situations within which there has been political conflict within the organisation. Might not be you that's in it, but it might be somebody that's more senior. But did you find yourself aligning behind one of the parties? That's more the Foucauldian interpretation, is that you've become disciplined by the environment that's around you and the power structures that's in there. So as I said earlier, politics is integral in organisations. It just is. Learn to deal with it. Political arenas can be seen as being rehearsals for the leaders of tomorrow, but as a consequence of that, political skill needs to be seen as being a critical competence of leadership. But politics is rarely perceived as being something that's positive. And yet, differences are resolved through politics. Differences between individuals create resistances. Now, they can be varied and many, from something which is quite destructive, let's say strikes or whistleblowing, but to micro resistances, which is typified, I think, by things that occur in the British military, which is to consent and to evade. Yes, of course I'll do that, sir. And then you don't do it. Or you do it at a time that's suiting for you, or in a way that you particularly do it. Being late might be a micro resistance. Not being fully supportive might also be another form of micro resistances. And sometimes where we do have differences that are intractable and we do have considerable resistances, politics may well be the only recourse that you've got in order to be able to resolve that. Not ignoring the impact of power, because if it's somebody within your team that is a resistor, don't forget you have the power. Not all of it exclusively, but you have more than your team. The 4 skills of political competence, when you map them on this particular matrix, emotional, subjective and reactive on the one side against analytical and objective and intended on the other side, is the 4 skills are interpersonal influence, social astuteness, networking ability and apparent sincerity. But what is important here is to appreciate that political skill and the utilization of political competence is a strategic activity, and as a consequence of that, it has to be seen as being an integral part of leadership ability. Which brings me back to the 2x2 matrix that I showed you earlier on, but this time I've mapped some of the systems of influence on there. So if informal and sanctioned would be things like functional conflicts authority and control, interpersonal and intergroup relations as a power, formal and sanctioned, things like policies and procedures and so on and so forth. Unsanctioned but formal would be things like norms and beliefs. Yeah. But in the top corner, you've got organisational politics, which is very often referred to, or has been referred to by me when I've done my research, or sorry, has been referred to me by those that I've been researching as being playing the game. One has to understand the rules of the game, but the rules of the game aren't formally set out. They're not formally sanctioned. But in order to get things done around here, you need to know how to do it, and it's like playing the game. In other words, you need to be materially in contact and understand the systems of influence within the organisation. This is an interesting depiction of the two-headed god, Janus. But I'm using it here in order to demonstrate the tensions that can exist within the organisation between leaders and followers, and also the tensions that can exist within yourself. You have different identities, you play different roles. Who is to say which one is the most authentic? Now, I'm not suggesting that we have become split or psychically deranged, but you are quite capable of presenting different faces. You all present leader and follower interchangeably and are skilled and adept at doing that in actually trying to make real your own agency. If you can do it, and if you do it, so does everybody else. So rather presenting leadership as being something which is robust and simple, what we have done by introducing 3 more factors, followers, power, politics, we've made it more complex. But it's representative of what you actually do and what you actually experience. In order for us to unpack this a little bit further, I'd like you to take some time out to read this exercise guidance and complete it, and bring your finished script with you to the workshop when we do the virtual workshops, whenever it is. Okay? So first, in a sentence or two, identify a problem that you believe is crucial and that you would like to solve in a more productive way than you have been able to in the past. Assume that you're free to interact with the individuals involved in the problem in ways that you believe are necessary in order to make progress. What would you say or do with individuals involved in ways that you believe will begin to lead to progress? Write a paragraph or 2 on this. Next, assume that an opportunity to do this actually arises. How did you act? Or if the situation's not arisen yet, describe how you would act. On a piece of A4 paper, split it into 2 columns. In the right-hand column, write what you said or would say if the session is going to be in the future. Write the conversation in a form of a play. You might begin by saying, "Thanks for taking the time. This is an important meeting for me and I believe for the organisation." Now write how the other person or persons would respond or did respond. It's also going to be in the form of what they actually said. It's a script, in other words. They might say, "It's a pleasure to get together in order to resolve important problems." If the meet is yet to occur, write what you think that they might say. Don't concern yourself with whether your recollections or predictions are completely accurate. That's not the point of this. The key criteria are that you believe what you have written is close to what you recollect happened or what you predict is likely to happen. In the left-hand column, write down whatever feelings you had whilst you were speaking and thoughts that you had that you didn't express. You don't have to explain why you didn't make your feelings and thoughts public, but make sure that you actually make you refer to them. When you finish, read the case to make sure that you wish to base your learning on what you've written. It'll probably take you about 30 minutes, 40 minutes tops. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.